Friends, hello there. Welcome to part 2 in our series on the parable of the Good Samaritan. If you've not had a chance to watch or listen to part 1, I would highly recommend doing so. It serves as a foundation for everything we're going to do going forward. So last episode, we talked about the exchange between Jesus and this expert in the law. The expert asked, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus responded with, "Well, what's written in the Torah? How do you read it?" And the dude said, "Love God, love neighbor." Jesus goes, "Do this and you will live." And then we read that, but he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Now, when the man originally responded that you love God and love neighbor, the love God is from Deuteronomy 6:5, the love neighbor is from Leviticus 19:18. So what's in question here is who constitutes a neighbor. Now, the word neighbor in Hebrew from Leviticus 19:18 is the word re'ah. And re'ah could mean lots of different things. It could mean neighbor or friend or companion or family member or fellow clan member or fellow tribe member or Israelite or business partner. I mean, it could mean so many different things. And so what the expert is asking here is, who is my neighbor? Now, at first read, it seems like a very legitimate question, especially because we know that from Matthew chapter 22, when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment, which the expert may be quoting from here in Luke 10, is that Jesus' response is, you love God and you love neighbor. And as we've unpacked this, how you love God is demonstrated by how you love your neighbor. Indeed, Jesus said all of the Torah and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So if how you love God is connected to how you love neighbor, then what do you want to know? Right? Who constitutes neighbor? Which is why he asks this question. But friends, it's actually another bad question. And you go, why? Why would that be a bad question? Well, think about it a little bit more. And Amy Jill Levine, in her book, Short Stories by Jesus, she was the first to point this out to me. And I was like, oh, this is so great. When you ask the question, who is my neighbor? What are you also simultaneously asking? Who is not my neighbor? Right? Or if you were to ask, who am I supposed to love? Then you're also asking, who is not deserving of my love? And so when the dude asks, and who is my neighbor? Jesus goes, okay, this one deserves a story. And so Jesus then tells the story that we all know so well. And so it goes like this. In reply, Jesus said, a man. Yep, let's pause for a quick moment. Jesus doesn't give us any indicators about who this person is, what his nationality or ethnic background is. We know nothing. Rich, poor, whatever. It's just a man. And then we're told that this man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, this is true on both a spiritual level and a geographical level. So it doesn't matter where anybody is at. They always in the text go up to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, if you will, is the spiritual high. It is the center of Jewish life. And so there's a spiritual reality, but there's also a geographical reality because Jerusalem sat in the hills and it sat very high up. And so literally you go down from Jerusalem to Jericho. So on a map here, Jerusalem to Jericho is 15 miles. Some commentaries will say 18 miles or 17 miles. I just did the GPS coordinates. It's 15 miles. And Jerusalem sits at 2,300 feet above sea level. For those of you who are metric, you can make the conversions. Jericho is 800 feet below sea level. So over the course of 15 miles, you have a 3,000 plus foot elevation drop to get to Jericho. So you begin in Jerusalem, which is, very built up in this picture. It's a modern day photo. It's actually in the Judean desert. And then you end up in the Rift Valley at Jericho, which, by the way, you can see the deserty feel here in this photo, but lots of green as well. We explored this in the Zacchaeus series, known as the City of Palms for all of the date palms, lots of water. It's an amazing spring that is there. And it was a very wealthy city to reside in. Now, the distance between these two is the Judean desert, and here is an aerial photo of what that looks like with Wadi Kelt cutting through the middle of this photo. And here is a photo of me standing in Wadi Kelt looking towards Jericho so that you can get a sense of the landscape that it is from Jerusalem to Jericho. And Jericho, very strategic location. In fact, if you're in Jerusalem and you needed to go north, you could either go through Samaria, which you didn't want to do, and we'll talk about that in a couple episodes, but you would take this Jerusalem-Jericho road down to Jericho, and then you could run up through the Rift Valley. And so everybody knows this road, and it doesn't surprise anyone about what happens next when we find out he was attacked by robbers. Friends, this is a treacherous terrain. And so much of the road is very tight and narrow. Now, this photo I'm going to show you is coming out of Jericho. This is actually part of the Roman road. And when you look at this photo, you go, oh, it just seems to be kind of wide and a bit expansive. Seems like it's, you can breathe a lot in this area. But here is where the majority of the road looks like or runs through. This is the Wadi Kelt area, and as you can see, it's a very narrow path. And so because Jericho was a wealthy city, there was always issues with robbers around that area and specifically on the Jerusalem to Jericho road. And so as you can see very clearly, robbers could hide in caves. They could jump out on the road, and where are you going to go, right? There's a wall on the one side. There is a drop off into a canyon on the other side, and you are pinned in. You see, when Jesus is telling the story and they say, well, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, they're going, oh no, this is not going to end well. Right? It's like saying, well, somebody is, going through a dark alley at 2 o'clock in the morning in whatever major city comes to your mind. You're like, this doesn't end well. Exactly. And what did the robbers do? It says they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, the word half dead, or this phrase half dead here, means like this dude is in a very precarious situation, like dire straits, is not going to make it if he doesn't get help. And it also carries the connotation of being unconscious, like this dude was beaten extremely bad. Now, when Jesus starts off and says a man, the audience would have probably thought Jesus was talking about a Jew, but we're probably thinking, well, we'll know in due time who this individual is. Now, the two ways that you can identify somebody in the first century world was by their clothing and by their speech. There were lots of different languages and dialects spoken in the first century world, and so it is through clothes and it is through speech. Notice what Jesus did. They stripped him of his clothes. Jesus took away that identifier and they left him half dead, unconscious, unable to speak. Jesus has rendered this as just a man who is in dire straits. We don't know anything about him, which is the brilliance of the story, or part of the brilliance, because again, the whole story is predicated on who is my neighbor. And they're trying to figure out who's in and who's out, who constitutes a neighbor, who doesn't. And Jesus just pulls all the identifiers and just leaves us as a neutral person who is in need. And you go, oh man, what's going to happen next? Well, we're told a priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Now that you know what the Jericho road looks like, you go, what is going on here? Friends, if it's along this stretch, there is no other side. That perhaps for the audience, they started to chuckle because it was humorous because they know there's no other side. Or maybe for others who are hearing this, maybe it's not laughter, maybe it's like, wow, that priest and that Levite had to work really hard to get around the guy to quote unquote go on the other side. And so this leaves us to the question, what is going on here? Well, we find out that there are two characters that Jesus identifies, right? The first is a priest. Who was a priest? A priest was one of the worship leaders, if you will, for the Israelites. These are one of the religious leaders. They're at the temple 2 weeks out of the year. So there were 24 different divisions of priests. They served 2 weeks out of the year. And then in addition to that, the priests were on hand for all of the major festivals in Jerusalem. So these are spiritual leaders among the people. And so when we have a priest who passes by on the other side, the question becomes, why? What's going on here? Well, in the background, we might be dealing with ritual purity. Here's what I mean by that. Numbers 19 and Leviticus 21 talk about stipulations for priests. Notice the Leviticus 21 passage. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, a priest must not make himself ceremonially unclean for any of his people who die, except for a close relative such as his mother or father, his son or daughter, his brother." And then it goes on from there. And so if you became ritually or ceremonially unclean, there was a significant process that you had to go through back at the temple that included a red heifer and standing at the gate, and it was probably very shameful for the person who incurred this. And so there's a lot at stake for the priest. In addition to this, Kenneth Bailey in his book, Through Pez and Eyes, he says this. He says, the priest collects, distributes, and eats tithes. If he defiles himself, he can do none of these things, and his family and servants will suffer the consequences with him. Now, some people who have looked at this passage will say, well, the priest is actually going down, which means that he has left his service at the temple, and therefore he is no longer as concerned because he's not going up to lead the people. In fact, he's just completed his service. Well, that's one way of looking at it. Kenneth Bailey would say, no, there's still issues at play that's going to affect his family if he becomes unclean. Now, there's also, according to Jewish law, that a priest couldn't get within 4 cubits of a person who is dead outside of those immediate family members, which is 6 feet, by the way. And so the implication here is that the priest is looking at this and going, it's going to cost me too much. And what's more, the priest doesn't know whether or not he's dead or not. Right? That's the brilliance behind all of these details Jesus gives. The man is unconscious. Is he dead? Is he not? And if I get within, 6 feet and he is not dead, well, then I can, do something about it. But if he is dead, I become unclean. Can you see the tension that is playing out in this? So that is for our priest. Then we are told we have a Levite. Now, the Levites are the clerical aides at the temple. There's a lot more Levites than there are priests, and their stipulations around ritual purity were not as stringent. In fact, they only observed ritual purity while they were serving at the temple. Outside of the temple, if you will, it's kind of open season. And so, the Levite came. Now, what's interesting here is that when the priest, he saw and he passed by, the Levite came to the place. The idea is he came closer. That 4 cubit, 6 feet restriction was not on a Levite. And so the idea is he's getting closer, but again, he sees him and then he passes by on the other side. Why in the world are they doing this? Is it about ritual purity? Is it about something else? Friends, welcome to the debate. And this is why I just want to take a few moments and highlight for you what often happens in biblical studies. We don't know for certain what is informing the decisions of the priest and the Levite, right? Jesus is telling this story, and scholars agree on certain things and disagree on other things, and this can be very typical with certain aspects of the story that Jesus didn't clearly give us the motives for the priest and the Levite. So Kenneth Bailey, Gary Burge, others would say, ritual purity is a big part of this. Amy Jill Levine, she's like, it has nothing to do with it whatsoever. In fact, notice what she says. She says their responsibility was to save a life. They failed. Saving a life is so important that Jewish law mandates that it override every other concern, including keeping the Sabbath. Their responsibility, should the man have died, was to bury the corpse. They failed here as well. So she says, no, this is about Jewish law, and Jewish law stipulates saving a life is more important than anything else. Now, what she's referring to here is this Hebrew phrase, pikuach nefesh, and it literally means saving a human life. And it is the principle that the preservation of human life overrides virtually all other religious commandments. Now, when she says that this is part of Jewish law, it's important to make this distinction. And the distinction is what is part of oral law and what's part of written law. Here's what I mean. Notice these two groups of people, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These are your two predominant Jewish groups in the first century world. The Pharisees held to the written Torah, the commandments of God in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They also held to what is called the oral Torah. And the idea here is that at Mount Sinai, when God is giving these instructions to Moses that will eventually be written down, God gives additional commandments that were supposed to be passed on orally from generation to generation through the elders of Israel. And so we have what these are, or many of them, because they were eventually compiled in roughly 200 AD in what is known as the Mishnah. And we're not going to talk about why they were compiled if they were supposed to be passed on orally, but we have them. And so the Pharisees held to the written commandments of God as well as the oral commandments given to Moses and passed down from the generation to generation. The Sadducees, on the other hand, only held to the written Torah or to the 5 books of Moses. Now, why is this significant? Well, pikuach nefesh is actually part of the oral Torah, and many scholars believe that the priest and the Levite are actually Sadducees. So understand this from the audience of Jesus, is that for those who were Sadducees and believed that the priest and the Levite were Sadducees, they would say, hey, you can't blame them. They were just doing the letter of the law, right? Whereas those who were Pharisees are going, no, saving of a human life, like that is more important than everything else. Like they should have helped the man if he was in need, and if he was dead, then they had a responsibility in order to bury the corpse. And so the debate continues. Is it about ritual purity? Is it not? Is it, pikuach nefesh, or is it not? Are they actually Sadducees? Are they not? Are they Sadducees, but they're supposed to abide by some of the oral traditions? Friends, we don't know. The debate continues. But here's what I love about what Amy Jill Levine continues with when she writes, the best explanation I've heard for the refusal of the priest and the Levite to come to the aid of the man in the ditch comes from Martin Luther King Jr., who preached, I'm going to tell you what my imagination tells me. It's possible these men were afraid. And so, the first question that the priest and the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? Oh man, is this gold or what? What Martin Luther King Jr. here is he's talking about shifting the focus. We must shift the focus. That we are always so me-focused first. What will happen to me if I stop, rather than what will happen to them if I don't? Now, the issue that Martin Luther King Jr. highlights is potentially around fear, right? He says it was fear, and maybe it was, right? This man had just been attacked by robbers. For the priest and the Levite to stop, they would be putting themselves in harm's way. And so maybe it is an issue of fear. Maybe it's an issue of fear, right, that for the priest, that he and his family are not going to get what they need because he's going to have to go through the process of becoming ritually clean. Maybe it was an issue of fear. Friends, maybe it was also an issue of inconvenience. Right? That they literally did not want to help the man who was in need. That would require them stopping and helping and assisting and getting him to where he needs to be because the dude is in dire straits. And if he was dead, it would take time and energy to go bury the man. And maybe as they're walking along and they see this, they go, we're not going to do this. And they pass by on the other side. Maybe the issue was fear, or maybe it was inconvenience. Friends, we don't know. But what we do know is that the priest saw and passed by on the other side. The Levite came, right, closer. He saw and he passed by on the other side. But then we have a Samaritan. And we're going to unpack what the Samaritan does in the next episode. But recognize he came and he saw, and then he responded with compassion. And we're going to talk about all the things he did, and we're going to talk about the significance of this word in our next episode. But friends, the way that the story ends is that Jesus is responding to the question that the expert asked initially, which was, and who is my neighbor? And Jesus' response, which of these three do you think was a neighbor? So the man says, well, who is a neighbor? And we said, well, that's actually a bad question. And Jesus is reframing it for him, and he says, who was a neighbor? And here's the point that I'm making. This parable is not about identifying who is a neighbor. It's about whether or not we are a neighbor. And friends, in this episode, we have looked at the first facet, which is that we must be willing to shift the focus in order to become a neighbor, the kind of neighbor Jesus is calling us to be. And over the remaining episodes here in the Good Samaritan, we're going to unpack the other pieces to this, but this is the first facet, if you will. We must shift the focus. And so, friends, let me just ask a couple of just real quick questions as we conclude. How is the Holy Spirit meeting you in the midst of this episode? Where have you allowed fear, self-preservation, get in the way of helping people who are in need? Where has inconvenience prevented you from responding in compassion like the Good Samaritan? What would it look like for us to shift the focus from ourselves and not just ask the question, what are the implications for me, but to shift the focus and say, but what are the implications for them? Would that change how we respond? Friends, I believe the answer to that is yes. And in the next episode, we're going to talk about what the Good Samaritan did and how we can move from a focus to ourselves to others, and then what we do on the heels of that as we continue this incredible series on the parable of the Good Samaritan. So friends, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for listening, and may you walk out this text well in your life.